So convenient. Hello, my name is Edwin, and I'm excited to welcome you to our ongoing speaker series. Tonight, we have Nina King-Skitsmo to talk about new developments in React and the React compiler. Nina, whenever you're ready, please.
Thanks, Edwin. I want to start off by thanking Remake Labs for sponsoring this tech talk. My name is Nina King-Skitsmo, and tonight I'll be talking about the exciting new features that comes with the release of React 19 and the React compiler. React 19 brings several new exciting features, but since we won't be able to go over all of them tonight, we'll explore 5 of the most impactful features of this release. We will begin with an introduction of actions, then take a high-level look at the latest hooks, discuss the SEO benefits of document metadata, and finally, we'll talk about the React compiler, followed with a summary of tonight's talk. So the new features in React 19 have gotten mixed reactions from the dev community. Some argue that the new hooks introduce a necessary abstraction, detracting from code functionality. Others criticize the React compiler as a late addition, suggesting it's a sign that React is falling behind. On the other hand, many developers are excited about these changes, expecting them to increase productivity, cut down on errors, and reduce unnecessary re-renders. Let's dive into actions. If you work with Next.js, you might already be familiar with this concept. Actions are now becoming a stable feature in React 2. Actions in React 19 are all about making it easier to handle stuff like updating data and managing state in your applications. They're super handy for cutting down on the repetitive code and loading states. Actions make working with forms much easier by simplifying form management and validation. They're basically just functions that are triggered on form submission. These actions are connected to the action prop of any form element. So again, if you work with Next.js, you know that you can create a form, and instead of passing it an onSubmit handler, you can pass it an action. And this action receives all of the form data, which allows you to process it as needed. Actions have already been a feature in React, but now it will actually be stable. And there are hooks built around it that makes dealing with state, loading, etc. so much easier. This release also simplifies handling action in both client and server environments, with the introduction of use client and use server directives. This is a very simple but important update in this version of React. The only thing you basically need to do is to add use server or use client on top of your component file to tell React whether your component should run in the client or the server. Next, there are 2 new hooks that are being added in order to simplify the way we work with forms in React, specifically useFormStatus and useFormState. Let's quickly go over these 2 new hooks, starting with useFormStatus. So useFormStatus is a hook that can be used if your action is asynchronous. If your action is asynchronous, you won't know exactly when your form submission is completed. To prevent the form from being submitted again while submission is pending, you could use the useFormStatus hook to, for example, disable the submit button until the form has been submitted. But what if you want the data returned from an action? Then you can utilize the new stateful hook called useFormState. It's somewhat familiar to the useState hook that we're all familiar with, except that it uses an action function to set the new state. Unlike useState, which just handles local state, useFormState works directly with actions. This lets it update state based on things like server feedback. It's really helpful for complex forms that need to react to data from asynchronous actions, making your form smarter and more responsive to user inputs. And another interesting hook that's being added is useOptimistic, which allows you to do optimistic updates. So for example, imagine that we're sending a message in a chat application. With useOptimistic, the UI can immediately reflect that the message has been sent while still being processed by the server, and then update it with the server state as delivered when the actual message has been successfully submitted. Or if not so successful, update your component with the error state if the message fails to send. You can implement optimistic updates in current React by manually managing state transitions and error handling. But this new hook will make this process simplified, since the hook helps manage optimistic state transitions, which will result in less boilerplate code and complexity in setting up these interactions. The last hook that we'll cover tonight is the new API called use, which is basically a multi-purpose hook that will simplify the way that we load resources asynchronously. So before the use hook, data fetching and handling async logic in React components often involved using use effect and local state management. Let's compare these two hooks to data fetching in React before and after the introduction of the use hook. So on the left, we see the traditional way of handling async data fetching using use effect and use state. We define a state variable user and initialize it to null. The use effect hook fetches data when the component mounts or when user ID changes. This approach is fine, but it requires you to manage the loading state manually. The logic for fetching data and updating the state is mixed into the component, which can lead to more complex and harder to maintain code. On the right, we have the new approach using the use hook. Here we defined an async function fetch user to get the user data. The use hook is then used to suspend the component rendering until the data is fetched. This approach simplifies the code by eliminating the need for use effect and state management. The component is more concise and easier to read because it directly shows what data it depends on and how it renders it. So the benefits of the use hook could be summarized to that it will help you as a developer centralize data fetching logic and keeping the component clean and readable while staying focused on rendering. You also don't have to worry about handling loading and error states since the use hook will take care of that for you. Next thing I'd like to cover is the SEO improvements with React 19, specifically document metadata. In HTML, document metadata tags like title, link, and meta are reserved for placement in the head section of the document. In React, the component that decides what metadata is appropriate for the app may be very far from the place where you render the head, or React does not render the head at all. In the past, these elements would need to be inserted manually in an effect or by libraries like React Helmet and required careful handling when server rendering a React application. So what this update will allow you to do is to put the title tag, meta tag, and link tag anywhere inside your component tree, like for example, in a blog post. And it will automatically go to make sure it moves it to the right location inside of the head or wherever else it needs to go, which will in the end improve SEO. And the biggest change is going to be that they're actually adding a compiler to React. This is a big deal because for a long time, React only ran in the browser and there was no compile step at all. This tool will basically just take your React code and transform it into a more optimized version. Think of it as a smart helper that makes your code run faster and more efficiently. It does this by analyzing your code, removing unnecessary parts, and making sure everything is set up in the best way possible for quick performance. Currently, to deal with memoization, we have to do it manually with the use of use memo, use callback, or the memo function, which is really hard to get right. These hooks have been essential to avoid unnecessary re-rendering in React. So let's look at an example of excessive re-rendering in React that previously has been solved with use memo. So on the left, you can see that each time that we invoke our expensive calculation component, it will slow down the whole application without memoization. As you can see in these two examples, the only changes that we made to this code is to add the use memo hook on line 47 on the right in order to memoize the expensive calculation function. We can wrap the expensive function with a use memo hook, which accepts a second parameter to declare dependencies, which in this case is count, since we only need to run the function if we try to increment the count on line 67. This change will cause the function to only run when needed. This may seem pretty straightforward, but once you start dealing with larger and more complex code, using hooks like use memo effectively can become incredibly challenging and time-consuming. So this means that the React compiler will automatically add its own memoization for things like use memo, use callback, and the memo function, so you don't have to use those hooks ever again. It's going to be automatically taken care of for you by the compiler. This is a huge win because not only does it make your code cleaner and easier to write, but it will also make your code run faster because even with the most experienced React developers, it's almost always the case that the compiler will do a better and much more efficient job of finding instances where you could memoize your code. React 19 and the compiler aren't officially released yet. but they're expected to launch within the year. Interestingly, Meta is already testing the compiler in production on one of their larger platforms that you may never have heard of, Instagram, and the results are promising so far. If you're eager to experiment with a new version of React, you can do so by downloading the Canary version of React 19. And if you'd like to try out the compiler, you can download the experimental version, and it's linked here as well. This gives you early access to all the new exciting features and improvements, allowing you to test and provide feedback before the official release. So to summarize what we talked about tonight, we talked about several key enhancements in React that offer greater code clarity and more streamlined operations. Key updates include actions and new hooks. We enhance UI and data interactions across the board, with new hooks simplifying form handling and supporting optimistic updates for asynchronous tasks. We also covered the new API use. This allows for direct integration of async resources like promises in rendering. We also covered document metadata updates, which will improve SEO performance and user engagement dynamically. We also covered the React compiler, which offers performance boosts, simpler state management, and robust error handling. These developments are designed to optimize both developer experience and application performance. Thank you so much for your attention. If you'd like to get in contact with me to talk about the new exciting future of React or anything else, you can reach out to me on GitHub, LinkedIn, or through email. These are my resources listed. And once again, I'd like to thank Remake for sponsoring this tech talk. Have a great night.
Thank you, Nina, for that amazing tech talk on the new features in React. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions tonight, but thank you again, Nina. That was amazing. Bye, y'all.